There is a piece of land on this planet larger than Iran, larger than Mongolia, larger than the entire state of Alaska, and not a single country on Earth has ever claimed it. No flag flies over it. No government administers it. No border crossing guards it. It sits there, completely unclaimed, in full view of every satellite and every map ever drawn, and every nation that has looked at it has decided, deliberately and firmly, that they do not want it. That place is called Marie Byrd Land. And the story of why it remains the last true no man's land on Earth is stranger, more political, and far more consequential than it first appears. To understand what we're dealing with, you need a sense of scale. Marie Byrd Land covers approximately 1,610,000 square kilometers, or roughly 620,000 square miles. It sits in the western portion of Antarctica, south of the Pacific Ocean, east of the Ross Ice Shelf and the Ross Sea. It stretches between roughly 158 degrees west longitude and 103 degrees west, encompassing several distinct coastal zones: the Saunders Coast, the Rupert Coast, the Hobbs Coast, the Bakutas Coast, and the Walgreen Coast. At its interior, the barren, ice-capped terrain averages somewhere between 800 and 2,000 meters above sea level, though its mountain ranges push dramatically higher. And that's the thing. Most people, when they picture unclaimed land, picture emptiness. Flat, featureless nothing. Marie Byrd Land is not that. Beneath and above its ice, there are mountains, glaciers, hidden rivers, subglacial lakes, and, as scientists discovered not long ago, something far more unsettling under the surface. But we'll get to that. First, who was Marie Byrd, and why does a chunk of Antarctica carry her name? The answer begins with one of the most famous polar explorers in American history, Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd, a naval officer and aviator who became a national hero in the late 1920s. Byrd had already made headlines by flying across the Atlantic in 1927. He leveraged that fame into financial backing for something far more ambitious: the first large-scale American scientific expedition to Antarctica. In the fall of 1928, he sailed south and established a base camp on the Ross Ice Shelf called Little America, a sprawling, well-supplied installation that would serve as the launch pad for everything that followed. In 1929, flying from Little America, Byrd's expedition made the first aerial surveys of a vast, unmapped region stretching east of the Rockefeller Mountains. They were, as far as any record shows, the first human eyes to properly see this territory from above. Byrd named it after his wife, Marie Ames Byrd, describing her as a vital supporter of his expeditions. The name stuck. The region has carried it ever since. On November 28, 1929, Byrd himself, along with pilot Bernd Balchen, co-pilot Harold June, and photographer Ashley McKinley, made history by completing the first flight over the South Pole, flying from Little America to the pole and back in roughly 18 hours and 41 minutes. The feat made him a national icon, and he was promoted to Rear Admiral shortly after. But Byrd wasn't finished with Antarctica. He returned for a second expedition from 1933 to 1935, extending the exploration of Marie Byrd Land further and conducting more scientific observations. During the brutal Antarctic winter of 1934, he spent 5 months alone in a weather station hut buried beneath the ice, roughly 123 miles south of Little America. He nearly died there, suffering from carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty stove, before finally being rescued in August 1934 in a desperately weakened condition. In 1939, at the direct request of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, Byrd took command of the United States Antarctic Service and led a third expedition south. Roosevelt's instructions to this expedition were explicit: take steps to formally claim Antarctic territory for the United States. Members of the expedition appear to have made gestures toward that claim. But here is the critical detail: those steps were never formalized. No official, legally recognized claim to Marie Byrd Land was ever filed by the United States government, or by any government. For nearly 3 decades, some American maps and publications actually showed Marie Byrd Land as a de facto U.S. territory, a distant echo of Byrd's work. The U.S. Defense Department even stated at one point that the United States had a solid basis for a claim, based on its prior activities in the region. But a solid basis is not the same as a claim. And then, in 1959, a document was signed in Washington, D.C. That changed everything, not just for Marie Byrd Land, but for the entire continent. The Antarctic Treaty was signed on December 1, 1959, by 12 nations, and entered into force in 1961. Signed at the height of the Cold War, it designated Antarctica as a natural reserve devoted to peace and scientific research, prohibiting military activity and resource extraction. It froze all existing territorial claims on the continent, meaning the 7 countries that had already staked claims, the United Kingdom in 1908, followed by New Zealand, France, Norway, Australia, Chile, and Argentina through 1942, saw those claims suspended, neither formally recognized nor formally dismissed. And no new claims could be made while the treaty remained in force. Those 7 existing claims use lines of longitude as their boundaries, essentially slicing Antarctica into pie-like wedges. But when you look at the map, there is one slice of the pie that was never claimed by anyone before the treaty locked everything in place. That slice is Marie Byrd Land, the only piece of the entire continent, the only piece that fell through the gap. Every other portion of Antarctica has at least one country theoretically asserting some historical interest in it. Marie Byrd Land has none. 0. It became, in legal terms, terra nullius, no man's land. Over 50 nations now govern Antarctica collectively through the Antarctic Treaty system. But Marie Byrd Land remains officially unclaimed by any sovereign state. So why didn't the United States simply file the claim before 1959? Or why didn't some other nation step in? The reasons are several, and they compound each other. First, there is the matter of geography. Marie Byrd Land is remote even by Antarctic standards, and Antarctic standards are already brutal. The region has no deep harbors, no natural anchorages, no feature that made it strategically or economically obvious. The other claimed territories at least had proximity to major shipping routes or to already established bases. Marie Byrd Land had nothing comparable. Its extreme remoteness, its harsh environment, and its lack of any readily exploitable resource made it, bluntly, unattractive. Second, the U.S. has historically reserved its right to make a future claim in Antarctica but has chosen, strategically, never to do so. The logic is careful. If the United States formally claims its slice, it implicitly legitimizes all the other existing claims, including several made by countries whose territorial ambitions in the region are complicated and overlapping. By staying silent, the U.S. preserves maximum flexibility. It keeps the question open without taking a position it might regret. For decades, this state of affairs continued quietly. The land sat there. Scientists occasionally visited the fringes. And the world mostly forgot it existed. Then, in 2001, a United States Navy intelligence specialist named Travis McHenry was reading the CIA World Factbook when a single line of text caught his attention. Under the Antarctica entry, in the section titled Disputes, International, was a line that read, in effect, no formal claims have been made in the sector between 90 degrees west and 150 degrees west. McHenry recognized immediately what no country had apparently thought to exploit. The Antarctic Treaty prohibited nations from making new territorial claims. But the treaty said nothing about private individuals. On November 2, 2001, McHenry formally claimed the entirety of Marie Byrd Land for himself, establishing what he initially called the Achaean territory of Antarctica. He notified the other claimant nations on the continent by letter. None of them replied. In 2004, he elevated the status of his claim, renamed it the Grand Duchy of West Antarctica, and crowned himself Grand Duke Travis I. He began issuing passports, designing currency, and building out the mythology of his micronation. The U.S. Navy, once they became aware that one of their intelligence specialists was writing to foreign governments to seek recognition for a self-declared nation in Antarctica, required him to abdicate in 2006. McHenry eventually stepped back, reconstituted Westarctica as a registered non-profit corporation in California, and reframed its mission as climate advocacy for the region. The claim itself goes unrecognized by any nation. But Westarctica still exists. It has a website, a flag, and, as of its last count, thousands of claimed citizens. It's a strange coda to a strange story. But it's not the strangest thing about Marie Byrd Land. Beneath the ice of this territory, there is something that scientists have been aware of for decades but only recently been able to confirm, and it changes the way we understand the entire western Antarctic ice sheet. Marie Byrd Land sits above a mantle plume, a geothermal heat source rising from deep within the Earth, pushing heat upward through the crust and into the base of the ice sheet above it. A NASA study published in the Journal of Geophysical Research confirmed this with modeling evidence, the plume generating enough heat to create a network of liquid lakes and rivers beneath the ice, lubricating it from below and allowing glaciers to slide more readily toward the sea. The Marie Byrd Land mantle plume is thought to have formed somewhere between 50 and 110 million years ago, long before the West Antarctic ice sheet even existed. Its presence, scientists believe, may help explain why this portion of Antarctica's ice sheet has been so unstable over geological time, and why it collapsed so rapidly during the warming period at the end of the last ice age, around 11,000 years ago. When NASA's Helene Sarusi first heard the theory, her reaction was blunt. She said she thought it was crazy. She couldn't see how that much heat could exist beneath the ice without melting it entirely. But the models bore it out. The plume is real. The lakes and rivers beneath Marie Byrd Land are real. And the implications for the ice sitting above them are serious. The surface of Marie Byrd Land is home to mountain ranges that most people have never heard of. The Executive Committee Range is a chain of 5 major shield volcanoes running roughly north to south for about 50 nautical miles through the interior. The highest of them is Mount Sidley. At 4,285 meters, it is the tallest dormant volcano in Antarctica, and a member of what mountaineers call the Volcanic Seven Summits, the highest volcano on each continent. Mount Sidley was discovered by Byrd himself during a flight on November 18, 1934. It was not first climbed until January 11, 1990, by a New Zealander named Bill Atkinson, working in support of a scientific field party. Despite its significant height, it is almost unknown even in mountaineering circles, simply because reaching it requires a level of logistical commitment that most expeditions cannot sustain. Also in Marie Byrd Land, on the Walgreen coast, sits the glacier that scientists have come to call the Doomsday Glacier, Thwaites. Thwaites Glacier is among the widest glaciers in the world, roughly the size of Florida. It currently contributes approximately 4% of global sea level rise annually. It holds enough ice that, if it fully melted, average global sea levels would rise by more than 2 feet. A broader collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet, which Thwaites partially anchors, could raise sea levels by several feet, putting millions of people in coastal cities at risk of extreme flooding. Thwaites' retreat has accelerated considerably over the past 40 years. Scientists from the International Thwaites Glacier Collaboration, a 7-year, $50 million joint research program, have found that while a full collapse of the glacier is unlikely within the next few decades, it is set to retreat further and faster through the 21st and 22nd centuries. The mantle plume beneath Marie Byrd Land is not helping. Geothermal heat from below lubricates the base of the ice, and warming ocean water is eroding the ice from the front. Marie Byrd Land is, in this sense, not merely a political curiosity. It is one of the most consequential patches of ground on Earth for the future of global coastlines. So here is where we land. There is a territory larger than most nations on the planet that no government has ever chosen to formally own. It was named by an American explorer for his wife. It was almost claimed by the United States and then wasn't. It was claimed, sort of, by a Navy intelligence specialist who read the wrong line in a reference book and ran with it. It sits above a volcanic heat source that is slowly destabilizing ice that, if it moves, will reshape the coastlines of every continent on Earth. And it is governed, officially, by no one. In a world where every square kilometer of habitable land has been fought over, divided, surveyed, and taxed, Marie Byrd Land is the exception that the rest of the map forgot to close. Not because no one noticed it. Not because it is too small to matter. But because the forces of geography, politics, and timing conspired, again and again, to leave it exactly where it is, unclaimed, unnamed in any nation's constitution, and utterly indifferent to the question of who owns it. The world has a way of assuming that all the blank spaces on the map were filled in long ago. Marie Byrd Land is the reminder that one wasn't.